Welcome to Better Than Ever Live. Wherever you're watching or wherever you're listening, I hope you're making today your masterpiece. In this video, I've talked about it a lot. We're going to talk about the ketogenic diet. I've been waiting to do this for weeks. So we hear people talk all the time about keto, but we're going to talk about what that is. And then we're going to look at how it might affect your athletic performance, sports and exercise, things like speed, endurance, strength, and fatigue. And we have a few health studies to talk about before that as well. My name's Dr. David Geier, double board certified orthopedic surgeon, sports medicine specialist, and media medical expert. I help you feel and perform your best regardless of age, injury, or medical history. As always, I say this all the time, but please understand I'm not giving you medical advice, not about keto, not about what we're going to talk about in the studies either. This is meant for general information and educational purposes only. Now, if you have comments or maybe questions about the ketogenic diet, post those in the chat and I'll get to those at the end of the live stream. If it's about any of the studies that we're going to talk about, maybe I'll answer those as we go. I'd love it if you put your name and where you're located as well. So let's start with something we talk about a lot, and that is the Mediterranean diet. We've talked about how so many nutritionists call this the best diet there is for all sorts of reasons. And that is a diet of low red meat, very little processed meats or processed foods in general, lots of fruits and vegetables, nuts, whole grains that are high in omega-3 fatty acids and generally overall thought to be an anti-inflammatory diet. Well, there's a new study that was just published this week in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They took over, it was almost 300 adults, anywhere from in the 30s to the 80s, put them into three different groups. One group ate the recommended dietary guidelines. You guys know the food pyramid, basic, American diet, so to speak, maybe minus the junk foods, but relatively healthy foods. One group did the regular Mediterranean diet, and the third group did what they called a green Mediterranean diet. Now, I had never honestly heard of the green Mediterranean diet, but basically it was the regular Mediterranean diet, but they had 3 to 4 cups of green tea every day. And we've talked about green tea and how it's high in polyphenols. I'll talk about that here in a second. And they also substituted, instead of having a normal dinner, they had a shake, a green shake of Mankai duckweed, which I have never in my life heard of. Other than that, pretty much exactly the same thing. And they were looking at brain atrophy over the coming 18 months. And what they found is both the groups that did the Mediterranean diet and the green Mediterranean diet had less brain atrophy over the next 18 months, especially among the people in the study that were over the age of 50. But the changes were most seen in the green Mediterranean diet. Now, maybe you have access to that Mankai duckweed and you can make green shakes with it. I am all for that if you want to do that. What I would say is maybe you consider upping, if you do, and I'm a big fan of the Mediterranean diet, but upping your green vegetable intake as part of that. And also maybe add more green tea. And here's the thing about green tea. We don't know from this study what it is that led to the changes, the brain atrophy changes with green tea. But one thing we do know about green tea, and I talk about this when I talk about osteoarthritis, is green tea is high in what are called epigallocatechins or EGCGs, which are very anti-inflammatory with all their polyphenols. They're antioxidants, but they also reduce oxidative stress, which is thought to be very good for longevity, very good for the osteoarthritis pathways. They block those pro-inflammatory cytokines and degradative enzymes that are bad throughout your body, but heart, brain, but especially in your joints in my world. So I am a big fan of green tea. Now, the thing with EGCGs and green tea is you have to drink a whole lot of green tea to get as much as you can get from a green tea supplement. So I take a green tea supplement every day. I'm not saying, again, this is not medical advice, but that's something that you might consider. EGCGs are also thought to be anti-cancer and antiviral, which has made them sort of interesting phenomenon over the last couple years or so, especially the antiviral part. So take that for what it's worth. But the Mediterranean diet may be good for your brain, especially as you get older. The green Mediterranean diet may be even better. All right, we're going to turn to sexual health now. And before you complain about that, let's be fair. This was a slow week in terms of new health and sports and exercise and wellness studies. So got to deal with what's out there. But there was a fairly interesting collection of studies that just came out this week looking at exercise, the relationship between exercise and sexual function, or more importantly, sexual dysfunction. And one of the studies, it really threw me off. It was really surprising. 43% of women, 31% of men have some form of sexual dysfunction. And the two big risk factors that these studies showed are 1, obesity, and 2, a lack of exercise. So with obesity, one of the studies in the Journal of Sexual Medicine looking at men that either had an elevated body mass index, BMI, or increased waist circumference, basically they were fatter, larger waist circumference, 50% more likely to experience ED, erectile dysfunction. Looking at obese women, half of obese women had some sort of issue with either sexual activity, sexual desire, sexual performance, while they were obese. That was a separate study in the journal Obesity. But here's where it gets interesting. When they looked at least at the women, and I didn't see a similar study done in the men, but at least in the women, if they exercised 6 hours a week, which is a little less than an hour a day, unlike the obese women who didn't exercise, they experienced lower sexual distress and they had more blood flow to their reproductive organs than the ones that didn't exercise. Why this matters is that led to better performance and better experience sexually, better desire, better arousal, and more likely to achieve orgasm. Now, I say this only because this is something, sexual issues, sexual function is, to be fair, not something we talk about generally. We don't post that on Facebook or Instagram. We are reluctant to talk to our doctors about it, whether it's OBGYNs for women, urologists, or primary care doctors for men, it doesn't matter. Generally, we don't talk about it. But it's clearly 43% female, 31% male, a significant problem. So if you're not exercising, and I've talked ad nauseum about all the benefits of exercise, this may be another important one. And again, it seems to be related to, at least somewhat, to delivery of blood flow to our reproductive organs, which is a huge component, at least in men, in erectile dysfunction and some of the issues we talked about in women. All right, last one. This is kind of weird, but I think it's interesting. There was a study published this week in the journal Gerontology Medical Sciences and looked at one of the risk factors for dying early. Now, I talk about all sorts of risk factors all the time, whether it's inflammation or all sorts of other things. But here's one I have never seen before, and it makes sense, and I'll explain why it makes sense here in a second. And that's this concept of fatigability. This is basically physical or mental exhaustion due to exertion. If you score high in fatigability, you're going to die earlier, or you're more likely to die earlier. It's a really interesting study. They had almost 3,000 people, 60 and older, and what they had to do is they had to rank certain activities and how tired those activities made them on a scale from 0, I guess not at all tired, to 5. And we're talking 30-minute walks, light housework, heavy gardening, things like that. And then they sort of controlled for all the different variables that affect mortality, cardiovascular issues, and everything like that. What they found is the people that found activities as more tiring had a significantly greater risk of premature death. Now, I don't know if it's anything, I would bet it's not anything specifically about those activities and how much they made them tired, is that just represented cardiovascular fitness. As we talk about VO2 Max, and we'll mention VO2 Max when we talk about the ketogenic diet, but we're not talking about that as we get older. We're just talking about the ability to go up and down stairs without being out of breath, the ability to play with your grandkids and not just be exhausted. And that is where we need to get more older people exercising, not just to prevent earlier death, but it's good for the brain as you get older. It's good for just overall vitality. So to me, the fatigability is interesting, and I would love for all of us to take that whole scale, take the whole list of activities and say, all right, does this make me a 4 out of 5 on being tired? Or no, I can do this and don't think anything about it. It's a 0, and figure out kind of where your scores lie. It's an interesting way to look at the link between cardiovascular fitness and mortality. So for what that's worth, I've got to think about it. All right, somebody from Charleston. Good to see you, Jim. Robert, we're going to talk about ketosis and a dangerous condition for the body, so I will get to that here in a second. Let's go ahead and start it. I've been waiting to do this for like 2 or 3 weeks. I have experimented with keto off and on for years. I'm sort of on a modified ketogenic diet now, but it does have more carbs. I added some anti-inflammatory legumes and things, so it's not technically ketosis. But this is fascinating. There's a weight loss component of this, which I'm not going to talk that much about. We're going to talk about it in terms of how you exercise, how you perform playing sports. It's probably worth talking about maybe in an upcoming show. We talk about it as weight loss. If you have not heard of keto, this is a significant reduction in your carb intake every day. Basically, your body adapts over a period of time so that instead of getting its energy from glucose, sugar, we're getting it from ketones. Now, when we say ketogenic diet, there's all sorts of variation in what people mean by that, but typically a true ketogenic diet, you only eat between 20 and 50 grams of carbs a day. And if you do the math on ketogenic diets and go through everything you eat, that is really hard to do. You can do it, but you basically have to it knocks out a lot of salad dressings and things that just add up with carbs, even things like carrots. So it's tricky to stay down to those levels of carbs. But it's not just the low carbs, between 20 and 50 grams of carbs a day. It's moderate protein. One of the mistakes a lot of people make is they do high protein, but moderate protein, and here's the kicker, high fat. 75 to 80% of your calories on any given day, every day, come from fats, ideally monounsaturated fats, but they can be saturated fats as well. Now here's what happens. When you eat a high-fat diet, a ketogenic diet, that's going to lead to an elevation in circulating free fatty acids. Now your body doesn't have much glucose in your system because you haven't been eating carbs. So what happens is those circulating fatty acids lead to an elevation in ketone bodies. Acetone, acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate. If you follow a strict ketogenic diet, and I did this for about a year, where you do these blood finger sticks to test your blood ketone levels, BHB or beta-hydroxybutyrate is the one testing, but those levels go up. Now, what happens is when it pertains to muscle, when it pertains to sports and exercise, when you do a low-carb, high-fat diet, eventually it's going to utilize more fat in terms of getting more fat into your muscle, using more fat for energy because the carbohydrates, because the glucose isn't there. Now, I remember hearing about this, it has to be 20 years ago, and it was in Cyclist, but in doing research for this, it goes way back, way before that. But people have been sort of speculating that the ketogenic diet, at least for athletes, is the future for endurance sport athletes. And again, we're talking 50 grams of carbs a day or less. And if you think, all right, I'm going to train for 2 or 3 hours, how exactly does that work? So then there's thought, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. Can you do keto and then right before a big race, maybe eat some carbs to have that as glycogen for energy as you perform? So there's a lot of variability. But again, this has gotten so much more attention from endurance athletes in recent years because it's thought to improve sports performance. Novak Djokovic has been talking about this for years. Cyclists have been doing the ketogenic diet for a long time. And you say, well, how does this make sense? How do you do any endurance sport for any period of time? Well, let's do the math here. All right, so carbs are stored in the body as glycogen in muscle, and there's about 300 grams of glycogen in our muscle when you sort of carb load. There's about 90 grams of glycogen in your liver. Add that to about the 30 grams of glucose normally circulating in your bloodstream. If you kind of work that out, that's about 1,700 calories of energy that's available to you from carbs at any one period of time. So if you're a marathon runner, triathlete, cyclist, something like that, you have to replenish your energy stores, especially your glycogen or your glucose, every 1 to 3 hours. You just don't have enough glycogen and glucose in your system otherwise. So why keto looks promising to these people is that you would in theory be able to sustain higher levels of intensity for longer periods of time, because now your body can use ketones from fat instead of glucose. And let's be fair, we all have more fat stores in our body than just the available glucose. So again, I told you this goes back almost 40 years. 1983, there was a study of cyclists, elite cyclists, and they found that if they followed a ketogenic diet for 21 to 28 days, they could maintain endurance at the same levels of intensity. So then what is it about 21 to 28 days? And to understand this, and this is a big concept in ketogenic diets, you have to understand what it means to be fat adapted. Basically, your body shifts. Once you stop eating carbs and eat more fats, your body starts to use the fat and the fat stores in your body for energy instead of glucose. Now, that's why if you've ever done keto the first time, or you know people that have, you've probably heard the term keto flu. This is a collection of symptoms, things like fatigue, loss of concentration, irritability, and you have it for the first few days on keto. Your brain, your muscle, they're just not used to not having carbs and glucose for energy. Plus, the shift in diet, you don't get the electrolytes, the fluid shifts in your body, you just don't feel that good. It's also thought to be why athletes, when they switch to keto, notice the first few days, maybe even the first couple weeks, their workouts just aren't as good. But it tends to get back to normal somewhere around 3 to 4 weeks, 21 to 28 days. So once people become fat adapted, meaning their bodies now can use fatty acids and ketones for energy, usually they're getting back to normal performance again, 2 to 4 weeks. So what actually happens with athletic performance? So let's look at the studies that are out there. One study in New Zealand looked at endurance athletes who did the ketogenic diet for 10 weeks. Now, at first they had reduced energy levels. They said they weren't able to train as well initially, but after a few weeks they got back to training at a high level. They did struggle with training at really high intensities. But overall, here's what's interesting. Overall, they felt so much better. Higher levels of well-being scores, improved recovery from workouts. They all of a sudden had clearer skin and less inflammatory conditions of their skin, and overall, they felt that their bodies were less inflamed. Another study of keto looking at endurance athletes, but different groups. Moderate intensity endurance athletes, high intensity endurance athletes, and then just recreational endurance athletes. Not a single athlete in the study had a drop in their endurance performance once they had been doing the ketogenic diet from 21 days to 84 days. So once you're on this for a while, at least in a lot of studies say it doesn't drop your endurance performance. And they were able to sustain that endurance for anywhere from 70 minutes to 168 minutes. Now, here's where that problem comes in we talked about earlier. At some point, you have no glycogen, you've burned up a lot of your ketones. Where those endurance athletes struggled is when they hit the 3-hour mark of training, or even 2 hours, then that's where their performance tended to drop off. All right, I mentioned VO2 Max earlier. This is a really well-known marker of cardiorespiratory fitness. We have one of these in our office where we put you on a bike, you've got this oxygen mask, you pedal as hard as you can. I have not done it, but my friends that have done it tell me it's humbling because you think you're in good shape until you do a VO2 Max test. But what effect does keto have on VO2 max? There's 6 studies that I could find. 2 said that keto actually increases your VO2 max, which would be great. 4 says maybe not as much of a benefit. Another way to look at endurance is time to exhaustion. And that's an important metric because if you get exhausted faster, well, that's not good. A couple studies showed that there was really no difference in time to exhaustion between a regular diet and keto, but one actually showed that keto made your time to exhaustion worse, meaning you got exhausted quicker, which would certainly be a bad thing. Which leads to what I was talking about earlier, which is this idea of alternating high carb diets and keto. So one approach might be you stay on a ketogenic diet, you get fat adapted over a period of weeks, but right before a race, before a big sporting competition, maybe you increase your carbs. It'll preserve your metabolic flexibility and also refill those glycogen stores that you might need over a long period of time. All right, now let's turn to the other end of that spectrum, sprinting and very short duration sports, because this is a very different athletic need or requirement than endurance. So let's look at sprints. There was several studies looking at keto in sprinting athletes. Some studies showed no difference in sprint performance. Others showed that they did struggle in extremely short sprints, the 10 second, 15 seconds, that there might be a little bit of a difference or a decrease in the athletes that have to do the ketogenic diet. But again, a lot say there isn't. Now, let's pivot something that's also short bursts of activities, but not sprinting and running down a track or short bursts on a basketball court, but that's strength. We're talking sports like gymnastics, any kind of martial arts or combat sports, boxing, things like that, and then obviously weightlifting type sports. So there was a study looking at taekwondo and gymnasts, looking at normal diets and ketogenic diets using 1 rep max measurements. This is basically going and doing the heaviest bench press you can for 1 rep, or a squat or a deadlift, something like that. And they found there was no decrease in the 1 rep max, basically strength and power in the athletes that had been on a ketogenic diet, again, for 3 to 4 weeks. Now, that applied to pretty much everything they tested: the squat, bench press, clean and jerk, deadlifts. And that was true even for recreational athletes. The strength did not drop off. Now, the problem with that is, who goes to the gym and does 1 rep max? We do sets of 12, sets of 8. If we're in a gymnastic sport, you're not doing 1 iron cross or 1 tumbling pass. You need to be able to have a little bit more resistance than that. And so that works as long as your body can make enough ATP. But ATP is a very short duration energy. And so the thought is that 1 rep max and no decrease in strength with keto might be kind of misleading, that if we tested endurance strength type of things, it might not go so well. All right, and then one of the last things I want to talk about is if you're in a sport, and this really applies to our high school kids, but maybe older, if you're in a sport where you need to keep your strength up, but you need to keep your weight down. Wrestling would be the main one, but boxing and some others. There was a study looking at keto and keto diets for athletes that need to make weight. Basically, they need to drop their weight, but still be strong. And what they found is that the athletes that did keto did have a lower body mass and more lean muscle mass, but it didn't lead to less strength, decreased lifting ability. So for a weight class athlete that needs to get their weight down but still perform well, this might be a reasonable approach. I have all kinds of issues with making weight and what a lot of people do to make weight. It can be very dangerous depending on how you do it, but following a ketogenic diet might be a good way to go. Now, having said all of that, it's really, really important to know that it's very hard to do great research on keto or anything else because there's just so many variables that are hard to control. People, different levels of physical fitness. People eat the diets differently, different times a day. The VO2 Max tests are different. How they train is different. How one person trains for a long run is different than others. Different athletes might be different. Cyclists might be different from gymnasts, might be different from basketball players or sprinters. There's just a lot of differences that make broad comparisons and broad conclusions difficult. But having said that, this is what I make of all this discussion of keto and athletic performance. One, it is very interesting in a sense that in theory, being able to use muscle and fat to exercise for a longer period of time because you don't just rely on glycogen stores, it's very, very appealing. We have a lot more fat than we have anything else. But having said that, the key that I would tell you based on what all those studies that I read is that I personally, if I was an endurance athlete, would do a ketogenic diet for longer periods of time, become fat adapted, but right before a big race, maybe I refeed, add carbohydrates back in to get the glycogen stores back up so I don't notice a dip right before the competition. Now, the problem is again, it might be good for some endurance athletes. It might be good for some strength athletes, especially if you're trying to lose weight or make weight and maintain performance, but everybody's different. So what I would say, and again, this is not medical advice, if you want to try keto, test it on yourself and see what effect it has on you well before an athletic competition. It doesn't have the same effect for every person and every athlete. And give yourself enough time to become fat adapted because those first 3 to 4 weeks might not be the most fun you've ever had. But look at what's required in your sport or what type of exercise you do. Look at your personal experience when you're on keto and then kind of balance risk benefits with all of these. And consider, again, maybe that alternate where you preserve your metabolic flexibility, do keto for long periods of time, but maybe you add carbs in the days leading up to that. All right, let me see what comments you have. How do you know when your body's in ketosis? There's 2 ways to look at that, Robert. One is what I was talking about earlier. Basically, you use, there's various modern testing. You can get them on Amazon for like $50, $30. And then, but the problem is the little needles are like $1 each, which, or not the needles, that's not expensive. It's the test strips that you put the little drop of blood on it, and it'll tell you. And basically, you want your ketone level to be 0.5. Some people say 1.0 or higher. you can a lot of times sort of tell mentally. People will talk about they feel more mental clarity and they just feel different. The first time I got myself into ketosis, which was after a 5-day fast, and I was in ketosis by the end of day 1 because I had never been on keto or anything like that before. So yes, I felt different almost immediately. And I didn't have a really horrible case of the keto flu, but that's one way. But again, that's probably the best way. Some people, though, say they can just tell mental clarity and things like that. But if you really want to know, blood tests, the urine tests are thought to be much less accurate. There are companies working on a breath test for ketones in your breath that are supposedly as accurate as the finger sticks. And let me tell you, the finger stick, maybe I'm a wimp, but it is not the most fun you've ever had. At least the ones for ketones, it's a bigger needle than like the diabetics use for insulin. And I'm not gonna lie, and you push a button and the little needle pops out and sticks you in the finger. It isn't the most fun you've ever had. It's doable, but it's not something you want to do every day. So a breath meter would be a lot better for that. So this is another good one. He talks. Sorry, I didn't mean to take that off the screen. Is ketosis a dangerous condition for the body to be in? I am glad you brought this up because this is a huge misconception about the ketogenic diet. Ketosis is a good state. Ketoacidosis is a very bad state. That's what diabetics, uncontrolled diabetics, have when they have very, very high levels of metabolites that put their body into this acidic state. It is very dangerous. Ketones are not dangerous. In fact, people on chemotherapy, people that are that have a seizure disorder, a lot of times are prescribed a ketogenic diet and prescribed to get in the numbers of like 4 millimoles and higher. I mentioned ketosis is generally between 0.5 and 1 millimoles. So it's actually prescribed to be that high, and it's very, very safe. But diabetic ketoacidosis can be very dangerous. Jim, I appreciate it. He says, great info. Thanks. I very much appreciate it. And I hope you're enjoying. It's a beautiful day here in Charleston. I hope you're outside somewhere enjoying it. Should we aim for high ketone levels to speed up weight loss? So this is interesting. And I know we didn't really talk about weight loss here, but I have read a lot about this. Not that I'm really trying to do it to lose weight, but there is thought that, well, a couple things. The actual ketone level probably doesn't have all that much to do with the weight loss, where honestly, the higher your ketones, that means you've been eating less carbs. And so that alone is probably the benefit of the weight loss. But where the ketone levels to me how do I explain this? Where ketone levels matter to me, and this is what I noticed testing myself, and I've read this in people that talk about it a lot, people like Peter Attia, people like Tim Ferriss, is that once you hit about 1.0 millimoles, and if you can sustain that, fasting, ketogenic diets all of a sudden become very easy. You get through that keto flu. When you're trying to fast, if you try to do, and we're going to do a whole topic on this at some point, because I used to do 3-day fasts and 5-day fasts. If you aren't fat adapted, that first 2 or 3 days is brutal. It is really hard. But if you're fat adapted and your body is using the fats in your body as energy, it is really easy. And that's where you're, again, around 1.0 millimoles on a blood ketone test. You're in that state. And then fasting or ketogenic diets get very easy. It's when, and you're not really all that hungry. It's when you're not that you're really, really struggling with a fast. Let's see. Jim says, I'm in week 2 for fitness, weight loss, primarily walking. Energy is a challenge so far. Yes, the body will adapt. So my dad, it's funny, he used to run a marathon, or ran a marathon when he was younger. He was in great shape, but, and I hope he won't get mad at me for saying this on social media, but he is overweight now. And he, over about, a month or a year ago, switched to keto and experienced that exact same thing, where for 2 or 3 weeks he really struggled, and then now he doesn't think anything of it. And that's what I've experienced with most people. The trick, I will tell you, talking to a lot of people that have done keto, is if you don't go all in and you're sort of modified keto where you have more carbs than that, you have 80 grams of carbs a day or something, that's where it gets a little trickier. And so in my experience, again, that's where you sort of have to play with it yourself. I did keto for a while, like strict keto, where I counted the calories and counted the fat and all of that kind of stuff. But then I started training with Leroy Dixon, who's one of the fastest sprinters in American history. He was training me a while, and I struggled on my sprint workouts on keto, and I eventually had to do a modified keto where I added some carbs because those sprints were just miserable. You're sprinting 100 meters and 200 meter sprints for 45 minutes with no glucose, no glycogen. It was pretty brutal. And then I'll do one from said, can you walk on a non-displaced tibia fracture in 6 weeks? There's nothing magical about the 6 weeks, honestly. It would just be when a tibia fracture heals. The risk you run is if that hasn't completely healed, the stress just causes it to displace, and then you're talking about a tibial nail or a plate and screws. Would not be much fun. All right, that's all I've got for you. I went really long on the ketogenic diet, but you can tell this is something I really care about. If you want to read the studies that I talked about in this video, they should be in the description below this video. If you like videos like this, things health, wellness, healing, recovery from orthopedic injuries, whatever it takes so you can feel and perform your best, regardless of age, injury, or medical history, subscribe to this channel, click the bell to be notified of new videos I release and live streams that I do pretty much every day of the week. If you have a sports or exercise injury and you want to see somebody who knows about bone and joint injuries in athletes and active people, I am here to help. I'm a double board certified orthopedic surgeon and sports medicine specialist. I'd love to talk to you about all your options, not just surgery or cortisone shots or physical therapy. So go to my website, drdavidgeier.com. In the upper right corner of the page, there's a contact page. You can request an appointment to see me. That information should also be in the description below this video. Again, my name's Dr. David Geier. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to helping you feel and perform your best, to feel and perform better than ever, I should say. All right, you have a great rest